edge is a shanty town filled with gold seekers. We are fugitives, and the law is skinny with hunger for us. That is a sentence that you will become very familiar with if you read Kevin Wilson's new book, Now Is Not the Time to Panic. This is Author Spotlight, and the author that I am going to be shining my spotlight on today is Kevin Wilson. Kevin Wilson is the author of 2 short story collections and 3 novels, and I'm going to be looking at those novels today. He has won an Alex Award and a Shirley Jackson Award. He teaches at Sewanee, the University of the South. He's an associate professor in the English department there. So back to that sentence that I said at the beginning, the edge is a shanty town filled with gold seekers. We are fugitives, and the law is skinny with hunger for us. This is the foundation, really, for Now Is Not the Time to Panic. And it is a sentence that Kevin Wilson heard in real life at a time in his life. He was in college going through some difficult things. And his cousin wrote this sentence in this online forum that Kevin Wilson was participating in, and it has stuck with him ever since. I read an interview with him where he talked about how this sentence is still constantly in his head, and rather than be intrusive, which maybe it started out, it has become sort of a mantra. And in the book, Now Is Not the Time to Panic, the sentence sticks very much in the main character's head. Her name is Frankie, and so much so that sometimes it's just even the word, the edge, the edge, the edge. So how does this sentence appear in Now Is Not the Time to Panic? It is 1996 in a town called Coalfield, and there is a teenage girl named Frankie. Her father has left. He has another family, a new wife, a new daughter, who he also named Frances, called Frankie, which our Frankie thinks is pretty strange. And she doesn't have a lot of friends. She has a desire to, as she says, just be normal, but she has trouble knowing what that is. And she meets a boy named Zeke. He's in Coalfield temporarily for the summer, living with his grandmother. And they are instantly attracted to each other, not necessarily physically, but they realize their minds work a lot alike. And Frankie wants to become a writer. Zeke wants to become an artist. They both have these bad fathers. Part of the reason that Zeke is staying with his grandmother is that his parents are going through something. His father has also left. They have this to commiserate over, but there's more than that. They're both bored. They both need something to do. They're anxious. As Frankie says, we were both so twitchy, so afraid. We were completely bored out of our minds. So they find an old Xerox machine in Frankie's garage, and they fix it so it comes to life, and they think about what they can do with it. And this sentence just comes out of Frankie. The edge is a shanty town filled with gold seekers. We are fugitives, and the law is skinny with hunger for us. And she writes it down on this piece of paper, and Zeke illustrates this, and they make copies on the Xerox machine. And they decide that it will be a poster that they will hang up everywhere. And they start to just post these little Xerox copies of their drawing and writing all over town, everywhere. If you happen to have read Kevin Wilson's earlier books, specifically a book called The Family Fang, you will know this sentence already. It will seem familiar to you. And that is because it also appears in The Family Fang. One of the characters, Buster, is a writer, and it is a sentence that comes to him, to his mind, and he just keeps working on it and chewing on it and mulling it over. So that if you have read earlier Kevin Wilson books and then you pick up Now Is Not the Time to Panic, you'll think, whoa, this is familiar. And that is one of the really interesting things about Kevin Wilson's 3 novels that I'm going to talk about, is these connections within them. It's also an interesting facet of reading multiple works of one author in a close together time period, because you start to see those connections right there. So anyway, back to the poster that Frankie and Zeke have made. Frankie thinks this is the greatest thing that she's ever written. It's this perfect sentence. Zeke's illustrations are of shacks, of children lying in beds. There are these big hands coming to reach the children. And then to make it this sanctified piece of art, before they copy it, they mix their blood and they drop it on the paper. And so it just feels bigger to them than just this piece of paper that they are copying. and they feel like it's going to do something. And this is their impetus for hanging it up. Well, it does do something. It becomes viral. And this is before a time when there is the internet. And so this is the way something could become viral, but nobody knows who created it. Everybody starts talking about it. Other people start copying it and putting it places. It ends up being blamed for certain bad things that happen. There is a panic around a poster that's hung up. Some people think it's satanic. Some people think it's an act of terrorism. There are people who build entire movements around it, and it becomes known as the Coalfield Panic. And this book is really exploring this tension between adolescent creativity, but also adolescent boredom and this sort of cultural paranoia, and also how the desire to affect the world and to put something meaningful in the world can have a great cost. When we meet Frankie in the beginning of the book, she is older and she is contacted by a reporter who says, "I know who you are. I know about the Coalfield Panic." And so the story has to start to come out. It's something that Frankie and Zeke keep secret. Nobody knows that they have made this poster. And years after the panic has died down, they're not even in touch with one another. And because this story is going to come to light, Frankie's going to have to reveal it. And that is where the story starts. And then you go back into 1996 and spend time with Frankie and Zeke and this sentence and this poster. But more than that, you spend time with teenagers in a typical adolescent setting in the summer, teenagers who are struggling to make sense of where they fit in their families, where they fit in socially, teenagers who are confused about how they feel about each other. So it's very much an exploration of the teenage mind and the angst that can come along with this period in people's lives. And also the challenge of growing up and how to do it right, how to do it meaningfully, and how daunting and frightening it can be. And that theme, the idea of moving through adolescence into adulthood, also appears in Kevin Wilson's first novel called The Family Fang, which was written in 2011. And that is where I said before, you do see this sentence, "The edge is a shanty town, filled with gold seekers. We are the fugitives, and the law is skinny with hunger for us." Family Fang is about Buster and Annie. They are the Fang children. They're the children of Caleb and Camille Fang. And their parents are performance artists who very much do installations that disrupt the society around them. They pretend to be in a situation that they're not to create reactions from the public. And they use Buster and Annie in these installations. And that is really how Buster and Annie spend their childhood, being used as pawns in their parents' artwork. And the book goes back and forth between their childhood and then Buster and Annie as grown-ups. They're being used as props by their parents in these stunts that are intended to create chaos in the environment. And their parents don't even refer to them as Buster and Annie, but yet they refer to them as Child A and Child B. So that is how Annie and Buster grow up feeling about themselves. The book might sound gimmicky. Some of the artwork that the parents pull off may be hard to even categorize as art, but a lot of what Camille and Caleb end up doing actually have real consequences because they are requiring that the public around them be part of their performance, whether or not the public knows it is being part of their performance. They will do things in malls, they'll start fights, they will pretend that there is something happening at the food court that's not happening. They do things that definitely require that the general public become involved. And so that there can be greater consequences because it goes outside the family fang. When you're reading this book, it is difficult, or I felt it difficult at times, to read about the way that Buster and Annie were being treated by their parents, because they have to go out and perpetuate these situations, these chaotic situations. And it really borderlines on this abusive treatment. And I think that Kevin Wilson in this book is really exploring the damage that can be lasting and permanent that's inflicted on children when their raised in this environment that is so chaotic, and in this case, intentionally chaotic, and how confusing that is for them. Their parents are well known in the art world, so these children are being told that their parents are doing these big, important things, and yet Buster and Annie can see that because of these big, important things, their feelings don't really matter to their parents, and the fact that the art has a wide audience receiving it and their parents are famous for their art, this just really underscores to Annie and Buster that their feelings don't matter. And so, as you can imagine, when we meet them as adults, neither of them are doing particularly well. Annie is struggling as an actress. Buster is trying to be a writer. They are bottoming out. They end up in interesting situations. Buster is mistakenly shot by a potato gun. Annie is humiliated by a director. So they both end up going back home to their house they grew up in with their parents in Tennessee. Looking back on their life, they start to realize that what their parents were doing was not right, but also they start to wonder how much of their own childhoods were real, because if everything for their parents was an act and a performance, what was real about Buster and Annie? This makes them angry, and now they're together. They're reunited in their parents' house, and they're sharing this anger. And this is something that helps them make that leap from adolescence to adulthood. This is where Buster creates that sentence, and he realizes that he's on the path to writing something great. Annie finally gets a job that she is proud of as an actress in a movie where she is cast as someone who is hired to take care of two children that spontaneously combust, which is a very interesting plot line. It is also the plot line of Kevin Wilson's second novel called Nothing to See Here. And this was written in 2019. And this was the first book that I read of Kevin Wilson's. It takes place in Tennessee, and it is about two girls named Lillian and Madison who are in boarding school together. Madison comes from a very rich background. Her father's a politician. Lillian does not. She's there at the school on special circumstances, and Lillian takes blame for something that Madison does. And it changes the course of her life, and she has to leave school, and her life pretty much plays out as expected. After being expelled, she lives with a single mother who can't be bothered with her, essentially. And Madison ends up, on the other side, married to a senator. This is where the book starts. Madison gives Lillian a call. Lillian's not heard from her friend Madison in a long time. And she says, I want to invite you here to my house. I have an offer to make you. So Lillian doesn't have anything in her life that she feels she needs to protect or hold on to, so she goes to see what Madison's offer is. The offer is for Lillian to take care of two of the senator's children from a previous marriage whose mother has just died. And these children spontaneously combust when they are anxious or upset. It doesn't hurt them, but it can hurt the people around them because they are on fire. It can destroy and burn down the things around them. Their names are Bessie and Roland, and they're 10 years old. And if that sounds like a really strange thing to read a book about, you do find yourself getting used to that idea. And part of that comes from the way that Kevin Wilson has portrayed it as the idea that they spontaneously combust when they are anxious or upset. And that's like an actual playing out of a real feeling that a lot of people feel when they feel anxious or upset, this sort of fire and this burning within. And that's how anxiety can feel for a lot of people. Kevin Wilson, in interviews and in writing, is very honest about the anxiety that he himself felt when he was younger and anxiety that one of his children experiences. Kevin Wilson also has Tourette syndrome, which for him comes to light in the form of intrusive thoughts. And that is why the sentence that appears in The Family Fang and the sentence that appears in Now Is Not the Time to Panic is so interesting, because that is something that Kevin Wilson is really sharing from a way that his brain works. And here again are these children that spontaneously combust, but are indicative of how anxiety can really feel for children. And what if this is what children did when they got upset? What if Buster and Annie in that early book had done something like this when they were upset? And what if Frankie and Zeke had spontaneously combusted when their parents' marriages were falling apart? How different things would have been for them. Adults would have been forced to notice and reckon with the anxiety that their children are feeling. In this case, Madison and her husband decide to find someone else to take care of the children. The senator, Madison's husband, is running for Secretary of State, and he does not want it to come to light that he has these children that will light on fire. And so Lillian agrees to take care of them, and the book comes from the point of view of Lillian. The children are mad, as you can imagine. They were pushed out of their father's house when they were 5. They lived with a mother who was strict, treated them strangely, but also was trying to raise 2 children who lit on fire. And now their mother has died. Madison and her husband really want to hide these children, and Lillian starts to realize she's really good at caring for them, and she really starts to care for them. She listens to them, she watches them, she understands what's going to upset them, what's going to trigger them, so they don't actually combust as much. And you start to realize that this spontaneous combustion comes not only from feeling anxious and from feeling upset, but it is a self-defense mechanism. It protects them. When they're on fire, they're untouchable. And that's such a good metaphor for another way that children come up with coping mechanisms. Lillian feels this connection to these kids. Lillian feels like she was discarded by Madison as a friend, by her mother who didn't care about her. These kids definitely seem like they have been discarded and now hidden. And so Lillian's also getting something from them. And this part of the book is so beautiful. Lillian's relationship with these children is just so strong and really wonderful to read about. It's impressive to me that Kevin Wilson has narrated this book, first person point of view, as a woman, and really done it, I feel, successfully. That's not something that always happens when male writers take on a female persona. As you might realize from hearing about these 3 books, Kevin Wilson does like to show these strange, quirky families, and he sort of has this predilection for the bizarre, but I think he's also showing us in all of these books the power of compassion and the power of love, and how differently people's lives can play out if they feel that they matter to someone and that someone's paying attention to them so that they don't have to seek attention. Having Lillian as this female narrator also gives us an insight into the complexity of her friendship with Madison, which is also a real through line in this book. Though it is strange and strained, it is in some ways a beautiful friendship and very well portrayed by Wilson as well. It's subtle, but it's strong. This book is really moving and at the same time laugh out loud funny. I would also say that there are parts of the other 2 novels I mentioned that made me laugh out loud. But then at the same time, also, there were parts that moved me greatly. Kevin Wilson has a real knack for pulling all of these feelings into his books. And in an interview that I read with him, he said that he wants to examine why people so often turn away when they're faced with need. And we put up walls, and he wants to look at what would happen in different ways if some of those walls came down. I think you could pick up any one of these books and really enjoy it, certainly be entertained, but also be forced to think about the ways in which people interact. So those are 3 novels by Kevin Wilson, and I hope that you give one a try. Thank you for joining me.